Hi, welcome to a new series called Sewing 101. In this series, I'm going to teach you about the very basics of sewing and why you do them. In this episode, we're going to talk about seam allowance. What is seam allowance? It's the distance from the cut edge to where your needle goes in. The distance of your seam allowance from the cut edge to the needle can vary from pattern to pattern, so you need to look in your pattern instructions and see what it indicates to use for seam allowance. This goes back to when the pattern was originally made. When a pattern is drafted, it has no seam allowance on it. That way you can make sure that all of the seam lines align exactly how they're supposed to. On this basic block that I drafted, you can see the seam allowance will match exactly to the notch, and then down from that notch. This basically means that when the pattern is sewn together with the correct seam allowance, that the seam line is exactly where it's supposed to be, and the pattern will fit the way it's designed to. You have to look at your pattern instructions because seam allowance can vary from pattern to pattern or even decade to decade. Most commercial sewing patterns like they use for production of clothing uses 1/2 inch seam allowance. A lot of indie brands use 1/2 inch seam allowance as well. Modern patterns like those of the Big Four, usually 5/8 seam allowance. Sometimes seam allowance can even vary. There could be 3/8 of an inch on the shoulder and 1 inch on the side seam. If you use the correct seam allowance, you can be sure that your pattern's going to line up exactly the way the designer meant for it to be. So how do you know how to have the right seam allowance on your sewing machine? When you look at where your needle goes down, some modern machines will have a line that says 1/2 inch or 5/8 inch. If you align the cut edge of your fabric up with that mark, then your seam allowance will be exactly the way it's supposed to be. What if you don't have a seam allowance mark on your machine? You can buy this really great little tool called a seam gauge. This is a magnet that will stick to your sewing machine. You can measure with a tape measure from where your needle goes down to 1/2 inch, 5/8, whatever your seam allowance is, and stick this little puppy in place. I'll post my Amazon affiliate link down below so you can grab one of these if you don't have one. So that's why seam allowance is important. It makes sure that your pattern ends up exactly the way it's meant to be. Please check back for more Sewing 101 tips and other sewing content from Wearing History.